All right. Hi there, everybody who's watching this later. This will be a review session over the short run aspects of Unit 3. I would call it like the basics of Unit 3, which is aggregate demand and aggregate supply, the graph in general, just sort of like brief synopsis, hitting the short run stuff, so aggregate demand in general, kind of as a whole, and then the short run aggregate supply curve, covering all of that, hitting the stuff that shifts those two lines, what those lines represent, what those shifts affect, how they change our entire economy, things like that. I'll probably also touch on fiscal policy here as well. No, I'll do fiscal policy in the long run video. And then I'll also touch on the multiplier effect in this video. So the MPS, MPC style spending and tax multipliers will also be in this one. So again, it's aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and the multiplier effects. This will not hit the money multiplier. This will not cover the long run. The long run aggregate supply and the long run self-adjustment process I'm going to cover in Thursday's live stream. That is typically the most difficult thing for my students in this unit. For most students, I find in this unit, that's the most difficult bit. And then that should be it. We'll do Unit 4 next week, Unit 5 the week after that, Unit 6 the week after that, and then we'll go into full, like, big picture comprehensive review, like pulling random FRQs that cover things from every unit, going through each part, connecting the dots a bit, stuff like that. But yeah, today we're going to do Unit 3, the basics, the parts that are pretty easy to deal with. Judson, good afternoon, good to see you in the chat. Yeah, we're going to cover that stuff here in a second. We give about 2 minutes until 4:30. Yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else that's big to deal with here. I'll let me mute my phone so it doesn't like go off or anything. In terms of things to be aware of, about 5 weeks from this week is our AP exam. So we're getting there. 5 weeks sounds like a long time. 5 weeks ago was like the first week of March. That wasn't too long ago. Seems like it was. It wasn't. It wasn't that long ago. So we'll be getting there pretty soon, so make sure you're keeping up with your review stuff. I've already done videos over all of Unit 1 and Unit 2, so if those were units that you particularly struggled with, yeah, those are already there. Yeah. Give them one more minute. Let's see, aggregate demand, aggregate. I'm trying to think of any big announcements, things to worry about, things to look at. Well, let me just test my stuff on my end and see if everything works fine. Also, I have that question on the board just yet. AP Classroom, camera's a bit big. Oh, I should change the size on that. That looks fine. Okay. Let's reset that a little bit. Yeah, that's fine. Cool. All right. Oh, let me fix that real quick and then we'll get started. There we go. Okay, cool. All right. Good afternoon. Anybody who's watching it live, anybody who's watching it later, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching it. This is one of many review live streams that I'm doing over, in this case, the first kind of half of Unit 3. Unit 3 being what is probably the most important unit in all of AP Macroeconomics, just because of how everything else from here on out kind of builds off of this and or stacks on top of this. So knowing how to deal with specifically the aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph, what it represents, what stuff can mess with it, will help you in the future when we get to things like the money market and how that graph ties into this one, or the global funds market, or the foreign exchange market, or any of those other graphs and how they branch off of / into this one. So we'll be covering the short run part of the graph, so what is kind of the easier part of the graph, but also what is frequently the part that is attached to things in other units, like when we talked about the forex market and how currency appreciation affects net exports. That's a short run thing for aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we'll also be talking about the multiplier effect. That's some math, not a lot of math, but some math for this unit, namely things like the spending and tax multiplier, the idea that every dollar spent is spent a bunch of times, so there's a lot bigger changes to GDP than you might otherwise think. But yeah, that is the game plan for today. I'm going to try and briefly go through the short run aggregate demand supply stuff and multiplier stuff in about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to go through a bunch of practice problems. I got a couple of kind of tricky FRQs that I picked for today's. So I recommend sticking around to the end or coming back to this video later and watching the last 15 minutes or so as I go through what are, I think, kind of difficult FRQs when you look at the first time. Okay, so basic rundown of what we're talking about here. Here's my super short, like, what I gotta hit in this review. The aggregate demand and the aggregate supply graph. The most important graph in the class because it is the graph of the economy. We're trying to get an idea of what an economy looks like, what our country looks like when we turn it into a macroeconomics graph. What we are really looking at is a market. And frankly, we're looking at a bunch of markets. We're technically looking at all of the markets, and every individual market is a supply and demand graph. And what we're effectively doing with this is we're going to be layering all of them on top of each other to get what's called the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. Conceptually and visually, at least in the short run, this graph does look familiar. It looks very much like any other supply and demand graph. The differences might be with some lettering, like you'll see SRAS here, that is the short run aggregate supply. You'll see AD here, that is for aggregate demand. The word aggregate, which if you haven't got on by now, that's important, it means total. Aggregate means sum total, SUM, like add everything up. So when we're talking about the short run aggregate supply, we're talking about all of the supplies in the short run. All of our ability to produce, every business's ability to produce, stacked on top of each other over brief windows of time. We'll get to that on Thursday of why that matters. Aggregate demand, that would be your current demand for everything in the economy. And not just your demand for it, but anybody's demand for it. That doesn't just mean other consumers, that means businesses might want to buy a product or buy resources, that's part of it. It could include the government, who might want to buy things, and it can include foreign spending, like exports and imports. The x-axis here is some level of quantity most of the time, although in this case, I like to use real GDP. Technically, the x-axis is quantity of output. It's like checking the total amount of things that we want or can produce. That's what these two lines are telling me. And the y-axis is price level. So here is your aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph in the short run, drawn by me using a mouse. So that's not going to look great. But some of you guys have graded your papers, have terrible handwriting, so this isn't that much worse than some of you guys. All right. So what is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand, as I mentioned before, is our overall spending. Or at least that's the best way to track it. Because the idea is it's our demand for all goods and services. And it's every part of the economy's demand for all goods and services. Which you got to think, how would we ever track that? Like, how would we track how badly everyone wants anything? You're like, spending. Spending is how we do it. Because you wouldn't buy things you don't want / need. Because wants and needs are kind of interchangeable here. So we track it via spending. Now, the thing to be aware of with aggregate demand is that, again, it's not just consumers spending, it's everybody's. So when I say we want more, that could be me, could be businesses, could be government, could be foreigners. The technical way to think about this, the way I sort of give it to my students, is that aggregate demand, much like GDP, at least the expenditures approach, is made up of C, I, G, and XN. That is consumer spending, me and you buying stuff. Investment spending, typically businesses buying things. Government spending, self-explanatory. And net exports. Now, the only thing to really be worried about here is that net exports is exports minus imports. That's a good parenthesis. It's exports minus imports. What you need to be aware of there is that imports are negative when it comes to aggregate demand. Because the idea is if you're buying a good from another country, you're demanding less of your own country, right? Like if we're buying goods from China, we are demanding less from the United States. So when we say things like imports go up, actually causes aggregate demand in America to go down because there's less demand for American goods and services. Now, these things pretty much cover you for what are the aggregate demand shifters. That if there is a change that affects any of those four variables, it'll affect aggregate demand. So we'll start off simple with it. When we talk about a thing like, say, consumer income begins to rise. For whatever reason, don't know why it's happening, but let's just say, happy day, we're all making more money. Great. Gotta love it. Consumer income goes up. Don't need to be a rocket science to tell you that if I have more money, I am probably going to be spending it. In general, that is what happens. If I got a bonus check from my boss, I am going to spend at least some of it. I'm not going to spend like all of it, but I'm going to spend some of it. That's more spending, so aggregate demand would increase. And remember, increase is rightward shift, decrease is leftward shift. So like an increase in aggregate demand would look like that. That's very yellow, very hard to see. I'll not use that color anymore. But that would have been an increase in aggregate demand. Now, higher level stuff, some ones to try and catch you. So those of you guys that are first semester students, let's see how well you remember stuff. Higher level ones, one we just went over in my second semester classes. Interest rates go down. Interest rates begin to go down. Because of an expansionary monetary policy, we see a decline in interest rates. Now, interest rates going down makes loans cheaper. So people and businesses will probably start borrowing more and spending more. That also increases aggregate demand. So like lower interest rates, even though like interest rates, not one of these four things, but interest rates affects investment heavily. It's an inverse relationship between those two variables. So when you see something like, hey, that's not one of those four, it's like, yeah, but does it affect one of those four? So I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, like currency appreciating and depreciating. That affects net exports. Fiscal policy is a government spending kind of thing. Like, it sounds like a simple list. Because of how much we learn from here on out in the course, though, a lot of the things we'll learn could like, oh wait, isn't that going to affect this? Yep. Isn't that going to affect this? Yep. So it affects AD. AD is probably the most changed thing throughout the course. It's the thing that we end up shifting the most often. There are so many reasons to change aggregate demand: fiscal policy, monetary policy, capital inflow, outflow, currency, appreciation, depreciation, loanable funds, market graph stuff. Whoa, my God, there's so many things. Okay. I'm not going to go through all of them because I'm going to reference them in future videos when I cover those topics, but there's just, a handful. All right, multiplier effect. So, these changes in spending and how they affect GDP, because GDP is there as my x-axis. So, a common assumption to make based on sort of this formula and the expenditures approach formula, which is that GDP is C plus I plus G plus X, and then you just add them all up, and that gets you GDP. Is that if you said something like, hey, there's a $10 million increase in consumer spending, how much should GDP go up by? The most like sort of obvious answer would be like 10 million, right? If GDP is CIGXN and you told me that C went up by 10, then shouldn't GDP go up by 10? That sounds right. It is incorrect. Only because of what is called the multiplier effect. The idea being, whenever there is any change to spending, there ends up being a much larger impact on GDP, and the logic's fairly simple. Whenever you spend money, that money is someone else's income, right? Like I gave a business $100, cool, that business made $100. That transaction might be over, but GDP ain't. The reason why GDP is not over is because now the business has $100 that it can spend, and business spending is a part of GDP the same as my spending is. So if I spend 100 and the business spends a chunk of it, and then the next guy spends a chunk of it, and on and on and on and on and on, because it's going to keep sort of passing around, all of that stuff goes into GDP. That is the multiplier effect, that any change in spending has a multiplied impact on GDP. And there's some things to be aware of when it comes to multiplier stuff. A couple of big key phrases to be aware of. MPC and MPS. These are the two sort of like big ones. MPC stands for your marginal propensity to consume. That's really long-winded. It's basically telling you for every dollar you earn, how much do you spend? So when they say things like the MPC is 0.8, what they mean is for every dollar you make, you spend 80 cents. Basically, you spend 80% of the money you earn. So MPC is your spending, and MPS is your marginal propensity to save. So for every dollar you make, how much do you save? So with that same example, if we're saying that the person spends 80%, they're probably going to be saving 20%. Because really the only two things you can do with your money is spend it or save it. If you're like, invest it, like that's a type of spending. If you're saying like, hoard it, it's like that's a type of saving, that's just savings. So those are really the only two things you can do with your money. So be aware that MPC plus MPS will equal 1. Now, along with that MPS plus MPC equals 1, we get the multiplier itself. Now, when we say the multiplier effect, the idea is that there will be a much larger impact than you guess when it comes to GDP changes. What happens is that you have the initial change in spending, like the $100 that I gave it as an example, and then you multiply it by a particular number, and that'll tell you how much GDP could end up being changed by. So the way you figure that out, the spending multiplier, I'm going to write S mult. That is just the spending multiplier. It's a multiplier used whenever it's a spending problem, is 1 over your MPS. It's your reciprocal of your savings. So if I said the MPS like I did before was 0.2, it would be 1 over 0.2, which is 5. That's my multiplier. And the way I use that multiplier is I take the initial change in spending times the spending multiplier will get me the change in GDP. I want to know how much that $100 increase in spending affects GDP by. Well, if the MPS was 0.2, I have a $100 increase in spending. I have 0.2 as my multiplier. So change in spending, 100. Multiplier, 1 over 0.2, that's 5. So 100 times 5, GDP would go up by as much as $500. That's the basic idea there. Now, from like a what's to be worried about there standpoint, that means that anytime we talk about things like fiscal policy when the government might be changing spending, it's going to be a lot more impactful than what you would have assumed, right? Because that spending happens multiple times thereover, that money is someone else's income, they can spend it again and again and again, the GDP impact is going to be a lot bigger than you think. Now, lastly with this, the last thing to make sure you hit with this stuff when you're reviewing it is that while there is this spending multiplier, there is also a different multiplier if it's a change in taxes. Because the same reasoning that if I lower your taxes, you'll spend more, which will then make other people more money and they can spend it too. So when you change taxes, it'll do this as well. But the tax multiplier, which I'm going to abbreviate as T mult, is negative MPC over MPS. So there's a couple things to dissect there. Why is it MPC over MPS? That is because whenever you change someone's taxes, they're going to hold on to a portion of that change. Like if they lower taxes on me, I've got more money. I'm not going to spend all of that. I'm going to save a chunk of it. So that's why the formula is a little bit different. When it's change in spending, that money is all spent. When it's change in taxes, a portion of it gets saved. So the number changes up. It's also negative because if you raise taxes, spending should go down. So there's like an inverse relationship there. If you lower taxes, spending should go up. So you get inverse relationships with the negative sign creeps in. And the formula to use that is basically the exact same formula as down here, but instead of change in spending, it's change in taxes times the tax multiplier gets you the change in GDP. Now this is all review if you were a person who just did Unit 3 like you're a second semester kiddo. This is all just, oh yeah, we went over this. This is not new information. Now, the last thing with the multipliers we have to make sure we get before we move back to aggregate demand, aggregate supply, because this is a detour, is the tax multiplier is less than the spending multiplier. Right? If this is 0.8 and that's 0.2, then 0.8 over 0.2 is 4, and this one was 1 over 0.2, so 5. Whatever I've got is that my tax multiplier will be less than my spending multiplier. I mentioned the logic there a second ago, but let me make sure you probably get it down, is that a change in taxes will have less of an impact than a change in spending. Like if we lower taxes by 100 as opposed to increasing spending by 100, the tax change is going to be less impactful because people save a portion of the change in taxes. Because that little savings bit happens at the top for whenever there's a tax change, because of that, changes in taxes are less impactful than changes in spending. So a classic AP exam question is like, hey, they increase spending by 100 and decrease taxes by 100. What happens? People are like, ha, they offset, idiot. It's like, no, they don't offset. The change in spending is more impactful than the change in taxes. So the spending would like win out in that scenario, meaning aggregate demand would actually go up. Because like lower tax, like higher taxes, that means we spend less. More spending means we spend more. Which one's winning? The spending is winning. The spending we actually do know is winning because of the multiplier effect. Okay. So that's it for the multiplier stuff. That was the mathy thing here in Unit 3. That was like the only real bit of math. All right, aggregate supply, short run. Okay. So aggregate supply in the short run looks like a conventional supply curve. We've got our demand, we've got our aggregate supply. It looks normal. The idea being that in a short period of time, while wages are fixed, businesses are going to, at higher price levels, want to produce more of their goods. At lower price levels, want to produce less because profit. At a low price level, they can't make a bunch of money off of their goods. They won't really want to produce very much of it. At a high price level, they could make a hell of a lot of money off of their good. They're going to want to produce the ton out of it. So we've got that going on. Now, what we need to be very careful about when we get to the aggregate supply curve is the fact that there will be a second aggregate supply curve. You guys are in the review mode, so you should be aware that there is the long run aggregate supply, so you need to know the difference. Short run aggregate supply is your current ability to produce things. It is overall business's ability to produce right now. So if I'm giving you a scenario that affects the business's ability to produce right now, say its labor productivity improves, every single worker magically gets really smart all of a sudden. Okay, we all, I don't know, like, watch Rick and Morty and get smart because people think that's a thing. I'm making fun of people, but still. That idea of like, oh, cool, now I'm smarter than everybody else. It's like, ah, yes, now everyone's smarter. They can produce more. Aggregate supply would then go up because if you have smarter, more intelligent, more capable workers, they can produce more. They'll innovate. They'll think of new ideas. They'll be able to make better tools, tech, machinery. So aggregate supply would improve. Short run aggregate supply would improve. The short run versus long run thing will be more laid out in our next video. So if you're looking for more long run help, Thursday is long run time. But short aggregate supply is just built around our ability to produce. I have a list of shifters for that. It isn't as helpful. But for aggregate supply, I tend to think of labor, capital, my C and my L look the same, natural resources, and technology as like the four big ones. Those are like the ones that I tend to focus on. Expected price level also comes into play there, but that one isn't super common. So labor, capital, natural resources, tech, those ones are the big ones. And the basic idea is if it lets us produce more overall, it's helpful. Now we got to be careful because aggregate supply is the supply of everything. So like a classic one that trips my students up is oil prices go up. Oil gets more expensive. Well, if you think about it like this is the oil market, you might think, oh, well, oil prices going up. The business is going to want to produce more oil because they can make more money off of it. It's like, that's not what we're saying. This is the ability of all businesses to produce things. So I'm not thinking of oil as the product I'm selling. I'm thinking of oil from a business standpoint as the resource I need to ship my goods. That if I want to sell my goods anywhere, I got to ship it. So oil is an input cost. It's a resource I use that I need to have to make my good and to sell my good. So if oil prices go up, I can't produce as much. It makes it harder for me to make things, which would cause aggregate supply to decrease. Let me pick the pen thing. Oh my god, what's happening? It won't let me pick a different pen? Alright, whatever. Oh, wait. I'm an idiot. I'm using two separate pens on this. That's not helpful at all. So my supply would decrease if oil prices went up. Now, if that happens, what we need to be aware of from here on out, the equilibrium bit, is what's happened to my equilibrium. I went from here, now I'm up here. So I have a lower GDP at this point and a higher inflation and a higher price level. That means two kind of bad things are going on. GDP dropping typically means a recession is happening, and it also means that unemployment's going up because GDP and unemployment have an inverse relationship, that when one goes up, the other goes down. Since businesses are making less money in this situation because GDP is falling, they'll end up having to lay off some workers to cover their costs. It's not good. So GDP falling would mean unemployment is rising. Additionally, since price levels going up, inflation's going up. So when you decrease supply, this is like a good thing to write down. When you decrease supply, you get what's called stagflation. You get both inflation and a recession, two bad things. They both suck really bad. You don't want either of them. You're getting both of them. So when you decrease supply, you get kind of like the worst case scenario based off of this graph. Like this is one of the more simple ways to see like a really bad thing economically. Is that, wait a minute, what's happening here? Price level's high. Ooh, GDP's low. Ooh, that's bad. That's also bad. Uh-oh. stagflation. So again, that's caused by a decrease in aggregate supply. It's bad because it's inflation plus recession. Now, last bit. Whenever you're changing supply and demand, because price level is involved, that is the average price of everything, anytime you're moving these lines, you are talking about inflation happening, or disinflation or deflation happening. So prices are either going up or down, or going up slower than before in all of these things, which is big. That's a huge deal for us from an economic standpoint. So what we want to be aware of is that there's two big types of inflation that I can show on this graph. What I see here, stagflation, is also referred to as cost push inflation. It's when rising input costs push prices upward. It's the businesses don't want to necessarily charge more for their good here. They kind of have to because it costs them more to make the good. That's not a fun time for them. They don't enjoy that. That kind of sucks the whole time. The other type of inflation is called demand pull inflation, and happens when demand goes up. When aggregate demand rises, meaning people want more goods, businesses can now charge more for those same goods because they have the same amount of them as before, but people want more of them now. So they can be like, cool, you want it more, well, we're going to charge you a little bit more for that. So there's demand pull, cost push. Demand pull, totally fine most of the time. Very natural for that to happen, that if people have more money, spend more money, businesses are going to start charging more for the good. That is just sort of like the price of doing business. That's just what's going to happen when you start doing better as an individual person. It's not crazy. Cost push, which is the decrease in supply one, sucks. It's bad because it means that the businesses got screwed over, so you do too. That's what's going on there. So we got demand pull, cost push, demand pulling prices up. Cool with that. Cost push, costs pushing the prices up. They're both inflation. They're both price going up, just for different reasons. Okay. Trying to think if there's anything else in the short run that I want to make sure I hit. Because there's a bunch of stuff I got to talk about in the long run, but I want to make sure the short run, if I have anything else to review or touch on. Demand is downward sloping because at high prices we don't want to buy things. At low prices we would buy more. That isn't crazy to think about. I'm trying to think if I forgot anything. I think that just about covers it. Yeah, that just about covers it. For the short run, at least. The long run is a whole other can of worms. It's a whole other thing we got to deal with. That'll be hard. But now we're going to do practice problems to see. Let's see if what I said makes sense, if this can help explain things. All right. So I just sort of covered this one, but let's see how we go. Policies intended to reduce demand pull inflation are most likely to increase which of the following. So it's saying it's going to reduce demand pull inflation so like that's been happening. This is a good, oh, you can't see my head's in the way. God, I make this too big every time. There we go. We have like this has been going on. They want to kind of undo this would be the logic of it. They want to reduce this, so kind of get rid of it. Are going to increase which of the following. So if I get rid of this, if I fix it, if I have it go back. So we were here, and now we're going back to here because they're reducing it. They're getting rid of the cost, the demand pull inflation. What would that increase? Would it increase GDP going from here to here? No, because it's going down. Labor force participation rate. I have no idea how I would be able to tell that off of this graph, so no. Price level. Price level is going down. It says to increase which of the following, so that's not correct. Unemployment rate. GDP is going down. Businesses are making less money. They couldn't afford as many workers then. That does work. Wage levels. This does not tell me they'll be paying their workers more. One, because in the short run, wages don't tend to change. But also, if price level went down, I wouldn't be paying my workers more. I'd probably be paying them less. If everything's cheaper, so should my workers be. Or so should, my workers should also be cheaper. So that's not too crazy. So that one, D. Second question. I picked this one because the drawing sucks. The graph shows aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply curves. Don't actually have to worry about the vertical line here. It actually doesn't matter at all. In the graph, cost push inflation is caused by a movement from what to what? Cost push, rising costs are pushing up price is by making it harder for businesses to make things. It's harder for businesses to make things. Which line am I moving? Aggregate supply or aggregate demand? Well, demand is our spending. Aggregate supply is our ability to produce things. Oh, so if it's harder for them to produce things, they can't produce as much. So this is a supply problem, and if they can't produce as much as my idea, then my supply should be decreasing. So I'm looking at A or B, SRAS1 going to SRAS2, or SRAS2 going to SRAS1. The way to think about it is, which of those is causing inflation? I need my price level to be getting higher. So if SRAS1 to SRAS2 gets me from here to here, that gets me higher prices than before, right? From here, this point that's SRAS1, to here, that point in SRAS2, I now have higher prices than before. So that would be cost push inflation. Okay, we got an MPC multiplier question. In an economy with lump sum taxes, you don't have to worry about that. Like, technically speaking, they can throw that in there. Don't sweat that. And no international trade. Okay. If the MPC is 0.8, which of the following is true? Okay, some things that I already know. When I see this, I can write some stuff down. My MPC is 0.8. MPS is 0.2. Got it. My spending multiplier is 1 over 0.2. That's 5. On and on and on. Like I can always do quick math stuff immediately as I read that sentence, where it's like, okay, that's 0.8, so that one's 0.2, multiplyer's 5, got it. Now I've got a bunch of stuff here. When consumption increases by 5, investment increases by a maximum of 1. Consumption is a type of spending, but so is investment. And the multiplier effect wasn't that a change in spending causes a larger change in spending. And this one's saying that it's a change in spending causes a smaller change in spending. I don't think that's right. B says when consumption increases by 5, savings increase by 1. That is still not the multiplier effect stuff. It doesn't say when, hey, we're spending more, so we're saving more also. I don't see that. Now, if this said income is going up, what could be happening? I mean, if your income went up, maybe this is happening, but that still doesn't really make sense based on my MPC and MPS here. I've got C, when investment increases by 1, income increases by a maximum of 5. Okay, let's look at the formula. It was a change in spending. Investment does work for that. Times my multiplier, which is 5, equals my change in GDP. It's important to know that GDP and income and aggregate demand are all numerically the same, because every dollar spent is a dollar earned, so GDP and income should be the same. And if aggregate demand and GDP are both made up of C, I, G, and XN, they should also be the same. So if it said income here, or GDP here, or aggregate demand here, that's all fine. It all works for the formula. So 1 times 5 equals 5 is what this question is saying. Yeah, 1 times 5 does equal 5. Thank you, question. I do know my basic math. It says the word maximum here. It's an important thing to mention with the multiplier, is that when you're doing the multiplier and saying how much they can increase GDP by, it isn't a guarantee that it's going to happen. If we have investment increase by $1, it doesn't mean GDP is definitely going to go up by 5. It just means it could go up by as much as 5. That is the best case scenario. Reasons why it might not is because different people might spend in different amounts. So that business that you're giving $1 to might not spend 80%. This is an average, not a guarantee. So if they don't spend all of that, then the multiplier stuff wouldn't happen that way. These last two is this one has the same problem as this one does, although the math works a little bit better. Income increases by 1, investment increases by 5. That would have flipped the spots in the formula. 4. I've got savings, I've got disposable income. Based on the level of savings and income data in the table above, which the following must be true. This is an important thing to understand because I didn't tell you these formulas in my little overview, which is that MPS, which is the one that I think will be relevant based on this table, is the change in savings over the change in disposable income. So in this situation, my savings changed by 200. My income changed by 2,000. 220, this is 110. So 10%. Or 0.1. Now that is my MPS. So if my MPS is 0.1, the reason why I say that is because it says right here MPC is 0.1, which that's trying to catch you. My MPS is 0.1. That would mean my MPC is 0.9. Because if I'm saving 10%, I'm spending 90%. So E is the answer to that one. All right, then we got this. Increase in the purchase of newly constructed houses will result in which of the following? These are all talking about aggregate demand. There is more spending on homes. Okay. Aggregate demand should either go up or down or not change, but probably here, if we are spending more, that aggregate demand should go up. So it ain't A, it is not D, it is not E. But if you look at these two, we get to a little bit of an interesting problem for some of my students, which is that, like, purchases of newly constructed homes, isn't that consumer spending? Because that's people buying the homes, right? Actually, it is investment spending. The idea that is, if it's spending that requires interest rate to matter, which would be like if it's spending that you as an individual might do that would require a loan, presumably, like buying a house, that is actually counted as investment spending rather than consumption spending because of the interest rate. So investment spending includes any interest-sensitive expenditures as well as business spending. So the answer to that one is B. That is kind of annoying, but hopefully you would have been stuck between B and C and realized that, like, the home is certainly not an export. You might have been able, like, businesses can theoretically buy a house, I guess. But the home doesn't make sense as much. All right, 6. If a large increase in total spending has no effect on real GDP, what the hell is happening? It's a good question. There's a large increase in spending, but there's no change to real GDP. This is not really a graph problem. This is much more a concept problem. What has to be going on? We're spending a bunch more, but our real GDP is not going up. What does real GDP represent? Real GDP tells me how much we are producing. We are not producing more, but we are spending more. How would that be happening? How would we be spending more, but not producing more? If everything got more expensive, we'd be spending more, not producing more. Oh, it's inflation. Remember that real GDP corrects for inflation. That's the big thing. If we're spending more, nominal GDP would be going up. Like your basic GDP would be going up. But the real GDP, the one that takes into account inflation, would only go up if we're actually producing more. If we're spending more, that might not mean we're producing more. Say we're spending 10% more than last year. If prices rose by 10%, we aren't actually producing any more than last year. We're just paying for the exact same thing and paying 10% more than we did last year. Doesn't mean we're producing more. So be careful. Real GDP tracks actual production, like how much are we producing in value. Nominal GDP just tracks spending. We're spending more, nominal would go up. Real only goes up if we're actually producing more. So price level. All right, 7. Here's the one that I mentioned with the interest rate stuff. An increase in real interest rate, consumption, and real GDP will do which of the following? Okay, so real interest rate is just the actual, like, guaranteed price of a loan, as opposed to nominal, like real will tell you actually how much you're paying. So if it's higher, I'm paying more for a loan for sure. Like loans are getting more expensive. Am I going to be spending more or less? I mean, if loans are more expensive, I can't borrow as much, right? Like if I'm trying to get the same home loan as before and the loan itself is more expensive, I'm not going to want to borrow as much. So I wouldn't be able to borrow and then wouldn't be able to spend as much. So consumption should fall. We get to C or D. And if consumption spending falls, if a category of our spending is going down, real GDP, since it's real interest rate, real does work here, the real GDP should fall. I am spending less, I am borrowing less, we are making less money. Real GDP is falling. Idea is higher real interest rate, aggregate demand is going down. This is just a way of saying that this specific part of aggregate demand is going down, and by aggregate demand decreasing, real GDP is falling. All right, 8 and 9. Last two, these are both fairly graph-intensive questions, so I'm busting out the whiteboard for this. Okay, for question 8, we got 4 parts of this, which are all kind of just different graph questions that they don't ask you to graph, they just ask you to say what's happening. So the question's asking, how does each of the following changes affect the real GDP and price level? I hear that. What I'm visualizing is, okay, these are all aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph questions, because those are the axes on that graph. So like A, B, C, and D are all like, hey, something's going to happen here. Because of that, what happens to my stuff in the short run? It says the short run right there. And explain each. Okay, an increase in the price of crude oil, an important natural resource. I actually did this one already. Is that if you have oil be more expensive, aggregate supply goes down like that. That's what happened to price level and real GDP. GDP should be falling because if it's more expensive to produce things, we cannot produce as much stuff, so lower GDP. And price level should be rising because if it costs more for business to produce a thing, they're going to have to charge more for consumers to buy it. B, technological change that increases the productivity of labor. Okay, labor is more productive. That helps businesses produce more. So instead of supply going down, supply would be going up. Which would lead to a lower price level because if it's easier for businesses to make things, they don't have to charge as much. And if they're producing more because it costs them less to produce things, GDP should go up. So those two both make sense. C, an increase in consumer spending. GDP should go up because we're spending more. That should drive GDP up. And price level should probably also go up. The idea being that if we're spending more, businesses are going to start charging more. That is AD going up on the graph. None of these ask you to graph. They actually ask you just to say what's happening there, but the graphs helped. And the last one, the depreciation of a country's currency. If you're a second semester kid, this is not something you've learned yet, but tag along if you want. If your currency is worth less internationally, that means that every good priced in your currency is now cheaper for foreigners to buy. Because your currency is worth less, so it'll take like fewer yen to get $1 or less pounds to get $1. So every dollar price good is cheaper for foreigners because it takes less of their currency to get it, which would make America's exports go up. Because if our currency is worth less, that makes our goods cheaper, which means foreigners can buy more of them. So aggregate demand's going up. So C and D actually have the same answer, where it's going to increase price level because people buying more of our goods, businesses are going to start charging more. And if we're exporting more, we will be producing more as a result. All right. The FRQ I want you guys to see. This is just like a nice little basic, like, oh, change the graph in the short run, that's it. Hey, this is the weird one. I picked this one because of the picture. All right, let me move my camera so you can see what's going on here. This is my graph. What the hell is this? That's what I would say about it. Okay, so I got my aggregate demand curve. That looks normal. There is a second aggregate demand curve, so I assume there was some like shift here. That says AD, that says AD asterisk / apostrophe, so I'm assuming that's the second one. And I see this garbage that I hate. A horizontal aggregate supply curve. Okay, don't freak out yet. Let's see what the questions ask. Calculate the spending multiplier if AD shifts to AD blank as a result of an increase in government spending of $100. Okay, so GDP went up by $400 here. It's asking me to find just the multiplier. Okay. The formula was change in spending times the multiplier gets me the change in GDP. It says there was a change in spending of $100. I am solving for M. The change in GDP, how much did GDP change by from this spot to this spot? Well, looking down there, 400. So that one's just 4. Okay. That's not too bad. B, will a decrease in income taxes have to be larger, smaller, or equal to $100 in order to shift AD by the same amount as the $100 increase in government spending? Okay, so $100 increase in government spending got me a $400 increase in GDP because it's a spending multiplier. They're asking, would a change in taxes have to be greater than, smaller than, or equal to that? Okay, so the tax formula again was change in taxes times the tax multiplier. Okay. The GDP change is still going to be 400. I need to solve for the change in taxes. Oh, that's my Discord. Don't worry about that. Now my tax multiplier is negative MPC over MPS, and technically I didn't figure that out yet, but I can. If my multiplier is 4 and my formula for the multiplier is 1 over MPS, then I'm actually just doing this, which would tell me that my MPS would be 0.25. People in Discord stop messaging me. Okay. Sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear that. I think I turned off that audio. But my MPS here would be 0.25. So my tax multiplier would be negative 3. So it ended up being 0.75 over 0.25 for the tax multiplier, and it's negative. So would my change in taxes have to be, and since it's going to be a decrease, so it knows that it's got to be negative, that's fine. Will the decrease in taxes have to be larger, smaller, or equal to 100? It's going to have to be bigger, right? Like if I divide 400 by 3, it's going to be like $133, I think, and 33 cents. That's more than 100. So it'll have to be greater. Explain, you could conceivably explain with the math, but this is the technical thing that I explained earlier, which is that whenever you're doing taxes versus spending, a change in spending will have a larger impact than a change in taxes will. So if I want them both to have the same impact, I would need to change taxes by more. The reasoning is because when I change taxes on people, they're going to save a portion of it. If I'm decreasing taxes by 133 million here, or whatever it is, 133, whatever, people will save a chunk of that money and then spend the rest of it. Technically speaking, they would save a quarter of it based on the numbers that I got. Okay, C, if the MPS decreases, will the spending multiplier increase, decrease, or remain unchanged? Okay, well, my multiplier was 4. We mentioned that. My MPS was 0.25. So let's just say instead, my MPS is 0.1. That'd be my MPS going down, which is what it said. If my MPS is 0.1, then my multiplier would be 1 over 0.1, which is 10. So the multiplier would increase. The lower the MPS, the higher the multiplier. The less you save, the more you spend. That's all that's telling me. Okay, D. Now assume that the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Okay. That's a terrible drawing, but all right. I actually want to make that better. I'm going to use the line. I can't use the line because I would need to pay for it. Absolutely hilarious. Capitalism strikes again. Okay, there we go. So assume instead of it being horizontal, which you hate looking at, assume it was normal looking. Would the change in real GDP resulting from the $100 increase in government spending be greater than, less than, or equal to the change shown in the graph above? Okay. Well, I mean, based on my drawing, which is crude and terrible, moving from AD to AT0 wouldn't get me as far as this one is. So if I'm interpreting it as like all I got to go off of is drawing, and I can actually tell you my drawing is right if it's an upward sloping curve, because it's just like I'm using my marker to imagine upward sloping line there. It's not going to go as far. There is an actual reason for this. So, well, sorry, what I should write here is that the change in GDP will be less than. If you wanted actual reasoning for that, it's because of the inflation stuff. That if it was a horizontal curve, us spending more doesn't cause any more inflation. Meaning there is no like real GDP getting messed with there. It is just raw. We spend more, we make more, that's it. But if it's an upward sloping supply curve, that increase in spending will cause prices to go up, which means my real GDP should be getting a little bit smaller when that price level goes up. So effectively, that increase in prices is going to eat into my real GDP a little bit. Because if it's a normal supply curve, inflation can happen there. It being horizontal just meant that when I changed aggregate demand, prices wouldn't change at all, which is weird, but that's what they gave me. And then E, now assume that wages and prices are fully flexible. Sweet God, do these guys need to like not do what they're talking about? I'm actually not going to erase everything. I'm going to erase all this stuff, and the graph has to change now. Assume that wages and prices are perfectly flexible, meaning completely flexible. Prices and wages can be wherever the hell they want. As a result of a $100 increase in government spending, will GDP increase, decrease, or remain unchanged? This is not a part of the review today, so don't be like, what the hell is going on for that? Because frankly, so is D. That's also kind of weird. There is a drawing we have where wages and prices are fully flexible. The long-run aggregate supply curve. On the long-run aggregate supply curve, the assumption is that since it's a long enough period of time... What's up, Bryson? Good to see you. Oh, hopefully you're seeing this terrifying FRQ that is kind of scary. If prices and wages are fully flexible, that means they can be kind of wherever, and that real output isn't going to matter. That if we're producing 1,000, we could have prices down there or there. They're fully flexible. They can be literally wherever. So a $100 increase in GDP, which would get me from there to like there, wouldn't do anything to my GDP. Because we would spend more, and then wages would immediately adjust for it, prices would immediately adjust for it, and it would sort of be instantly canceled out. Like, it would happen, but then we just have prices go up and wages go up and done. There is no like actual permanent change in productivity there. Which is weird. Like, this is a weird FRQ to throw at you. It's one where I saw it and I was like, wow, that's not a cool thing to do. The visual mostly because it's just to scare you. I don't think the question for D is actually hard. If you draw it, it's actually very easy. But E is kind of mean. If you forget how the LRAS works, which is that is the LRAS. They just told you, hey, if instead of it being the aggregate supply curve that you see, it was a vertical line, what would happen to real GDP if you increase the government spending? Again, on my drawing, if I do my AD shift, I just go up. My GDP doesn't actually get changed because the prices instantly get adjusted. They spend $100 more. Okay, this is going to lead to $100 increase in prices. Cool. No change to real GDP then, because the inflation instantly sort of canceled out the GDP change. Such a weird FRQ. But I wanted to show it to you because they do some weird stuff like this every now and then. This is not a common thing for them to do. But I've seen multiple choice questions for sure where they've like thrown a weird conceptual aggregate demand aggregate supply graph where this time the supply curve is vertical or it's horizontal, and you're just like, just accept it, move on. It's like, all right, it's horizontal. I don't know why it's horizontal. They didn't even tell me why it's horizontal. Who cares? And the only time, you don't even ever actually deal with it being horizontal other than in D where it says it's not horizontal anymore, and where E, where it technically means it's now vertical. Which is great. Okay, that should be it in terms of content and questions that I had for us to go over. There is frankly much more for us to do here when we talk about the long run stuff. But oh, you can see Archer. Look at him. He's just like hiding behind me. Hey, Bubble. Can't pan down. There he is. Oh, that's a good boy. Dog cam. He gets showed up on this camera. Good for him. Proud of you. Good boy, Archer. Okay. Now, if you have any particular questions for me to hit before I end the session, that'd be great. I would recommend going back, if you just got into this late, to watch the beginning part of it where I review the concepts themselves at the very top. A lot of these videos are just 30 minutes of me reviewing the concept, 30 minutes of me going through practice problems. So if you didn't get to watch me go do all the review content stuff, watch that later. If you just watched me answer part of the terrifying FRQ at the end, probably watch the beginning parts of the video that kind of lead into that. Those last two parts of that FRQ are super weird, but the first three parts I had explained previously in the review. Okay, but that should be it for the short run stuff. I don't think there's anything I'm missing from like I should explain this in this video. On Thursday, I am going over the big scary thing from this unit, which was the long run stuff. The long and aggregate supply curve in itself, the long run self-adjustment process, which is the economy always reverts back to equilibrium thing. Like what happens in the long run if the government doesn't do anything, those types of problems. And then I'll also hit fiscal policy at the end of that video as well to be like, okay, so if the government does do a thing, here's what they would do. Those kind of things. So that is the game plan for the next video. That'll be Thursday, 4:30 to 5:30. That one, remember, that's usually the hardest part for Unit 3 for people, was the long run thing. So make sure you're watching. If you saw those FRQs and were like, man, I forgot a bunch of stuff, that's why I'm doing this. You might want to watch more. And then all the other ones have saved on my channel. If you're having a hard time finding them, go to the live streams section, because if you look at like videos, there'll be like an uploads, and then if you hit like the drop down box, it'll say live streams, and you can click on those, and that'll pull up the live streams from previous. I also put a playlist up on there that is live stream review sessions, I think is what it is, or review sessions is the name of the playlist. That's where all of these get saved to as well. So you'll have access to these forever, all the way up to the AP exam. It's just better to watch them as we do them. That way you're not trying to review everything in the last week before the test. Cool. But thank you guys for watching.